Welcome, and doing something a little bit different. We're looking at Richard Rohr's book on the spirituality of the 12 steps called Breathing Underwater, which comes from a poem and is a good description of living with addictions. And here we're talking about addictions very much as a pattern of thinking which involves denial and self-deception, and is often involved with what we use the term ego. We use ego or the false self in different ways, but it's that pattern of thinking where we think if we do the same thing time and time again but with more energy and commitment, we'll somehow get a different outcome. Doing the same thing, hoping for a different outcome, is often used as a good description of addiction. So here we're talking about how we might think about the way we think. So there's 4 assumptions that he's making around addiction. One is that we're all addicts, where humans are addictive by their very nature, and we could think of addiction, we could use different terms from it. So in Christian terms we might think of sin. In the medieval times they often talked about our passions or our attachments, how we are controlled by our passions. And there's a recognition there that you need some sort of practice to help us break free of that. There's something that we need to do, which is the idea of the steps, the 12 steps, that you have to take each step before you get to the next step. Second assumption is stinking thinking is the universal addiction. It's a great term, stinking thinking. So we all have some pattern of thinking, the way we process reality, which can be quite negative, and much of that we're blinded to it, so we can't quite see it and can't quite get a handle on it. And when we can name it, whatever it might be, workaholics, foods, alcohol, drugs, exercise, just negative thinking, we're all addicted to something, but when we can name it, then we can begin to get some control over it and heal it. Thirdly, all societies are addicted to themselves and create deep codependency on them. And codependency is a big thing in addiction, but every culture has a certain level of addiction which is deemed acceptable. With massive amounts of TV advertising just now around gambling, your best brains in the field of addiction just now won't be employed in the NHS helping cure people addictions. They'll most likely be employed by some tech companies to make their apps more addictive. And as Richard Rohr says, the American has an addiction to oil, war and empire. The church has an addiction to its own absolute exceptionalism. Poor people have an addiction to powerlessness and victimhood. White person addiction to superiority. Wealthy person's addiction to entitlement. So you can see how addiction seeps into the way we think. Fourth assumption, some form of alternative consciousness is the only freedom from this self and from cultural lies. So if our universal addiction is our own pattern of thinking, then we need some sort of spiritual path or some sort of practice to help us break free from that. Lovely little prayer here. We suffer to get well, we surrender to win, we die to live, we give it away to keep it. So we're trying to think about the way we think in terms of what we are addicted to. So let's start. Step 1 of the 12 steps. We admit that we are powerless over alcohol or whatever we're addicted to, and that our lives have become unmanageable. Step 1. Here's a wee quote from Isaiah 38:12-14. Like a weaver, you roll up my life and cut it from the loom. From dawn to night you are watching my failure. I cry aloud until the morning, but like a lion you crush all my bones. I twitter like a swallow, I moan like a dove. And from Romans 15 and 18, I cannot understand my own behaviour, Paul says. I fail to carry out the very things I want to do and find myself doing the very things I hate. For although the will to do what is good is in me, the performance is not. And Matthew 9:36. And when Jesus looked at the crowds, he felt sorry for them, because they were harassed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd. So much of the 12 steps in this way of thinking is very similar to a lot of the gospel messages, and it's that strange paradox that Jesus and Paul pick up so well, which is so hard to understand. So Paul says, power is at its best in weakness. How do we understand that? Or he says, it is when I am weak that I am strong. So these paradoxes that we have to try and understand. And we all know probably that in life it is often when we hit rock bottom that big change begins to happen. I remember someone saying to me that they had to hit rock bottom before it felt like their feet were on anything that felt like solid ground, that they could make a stand and through that stand make a change. So sometimes the mystery is why when things are really going badly and falling apart, that the big change can begin to happen. And that's a bit like that idea of we admit that we are powerless. We don't like to admit we are powerless. But until sometimes we bottom out and come to limits of our own fuel supply, it's only then that we realise we need to switch to a different source of power. So something, when we're depleted, sometimes we're filled by a greater power, a larger source than our own source or resources which have failed us. It's a big thing to try and think about. So in the Christian terms, being powerless is to say that there is a greater power than us, the true manager when we can't manage ourselves. So God makes sure that several things will come your way that you cannot manage on your own. And that seems to be a truism about our life. We are not self-made, and those people who seem self-made, those people who seem so heroic, whether it's in their work or in their spirituality or in their dedication to other people, when it's all done on their own resources and their own power, there will also be a certain fragility and almost hopelessness to that being able to be maintained. We are powerless, and our true power comes from God. The ego itself never likes this idea of being powerless, and the ego always insists that it is taking the moral high ground. So again, we can turn to Paul for some wonderful descriptions of this. And Paul says, sin takes advantage of commandments to mislead me, and through obeying commandments kills me. Sin takes advantage of commandments to mislead me, and through obeying commandments kills me. It's that real idea of when Paul says that the law actually can lead us into greater sin and greater damage. Paul's got this brilliant insight that I think so many of us fail to have. And Richard gives us much more everyday examples of how we might get fixated on certain things, and then they become a way of transference, that all the stuff that's annoying inside us, we transfer it onto others, or we try and make scapegoats out of other issues or other things. Examples he gives is celibate priests focusing on birth control and abortion as the core of evil, heterosexuals seeing gay marriage as the ultimate threat to society, liberals invested in some current political correctness while living lives of rather total isolation from the actual suffering of the world. Bible thumpers ignoring most of the Bible when it asks them to change. A nation of immigrants being anti-immigrant. So you can see how that idea of we're projecting things that we're uncomfortable with in ourselves, or we're making scapegoats out of other people. But in all those cases, the ego remains in charge. It just disguises what we're trying to cover up. I mean, it disguises it usually into some form of good. So the imperial ego that has to go, and only powerlessness can do that job. So again, that idea, 12 steps. Step 1, the hardest one, which is about admitting our powerlessness. Richard has these lovely little quotes that he picks up from these different people and a variety of different people. So if you think about the ego is in charge, it disguises our problem by making it look like we're doing good, and it projects all that negative stuff out onto other people or into an issue or something that we can feel passionate about and committed to, while ignoring what's actually going on inside us. So he uses a quote from the physicist Albert Einstein, who says that no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused the problem in the first place. So in terms of the Bible, let's have a think about some of the metaphors that Jesus uses to try and explain that idea of powerlessness or death or subtraction. A grain of wheat, a branch cut from the vine. So think about those in terms of the ego, the grain of wheat that must be buried, the branch that must be cut from the vine. Think about that in terms of the ego. St. Paul uses the word flesh, which is a rather unfortunate one because we've tended to think it means body, but a lot of people now have changed the word flesh, and they try and get us to think about things like self-indulgence or the false self, or indeed the ego. So both Paul and Jesus point to this idea that when the ego's in charge, it's not our true self, and that idea of the ego controlling us has to die. Unless the grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains only a single grain, but if it dies, it will yield a rich harvest. And again, Paul says that the flesh or the ego cannot get you where you want to go. He says that in Galatians 5:19. The ego's concerns are too small and too selfish. So an ego response is always an inadequate or even a wrong response at the moment. It won't deepen or broaden our life, our loves, or our inner laughter. Our ego self is always attached to the mere externals, since it has no inner substance in itself. The ego defines itself by its attachments and its revulsions. And again, we can think of those examples. So the ego defines itself by what it's attached to, what it thinks passionately about, often dressed up as a good, or what it's revulsed by, what it's against, what it's trying to put down, often because it thinks those things are bad. And Richard Rohr, I think quite rightly, says the soul does not attach, nor does it hate. It desires, and it loves, and it lets go. Have a think about that. The ego defines itself by its attachments and its revulsions. The soul doesn't attach and doesn't hate. It desires, and it loves, and it lets go. And I think that's the teaching of all mature spirituality, and the teaching of the 12 steps. And the first step is the hardest, it's the most denied, and therefore it's the most avoided. And therefore often the whole process doesn't take off, because it's that idea of powerlessness. The false self is often what has so much control, it has that moral high ground, it wants to stay in control. Letting go is such a scary thing to do. All mature spirituality, in one sense or another, is about letting go and unlearning. The great German mystic philosopher Meister Eckhart said that spiritual life has much more to do with subtraction than it does with addition. What we let go of, not what we add to. And the ego hates more than anything else in the world. It hates change. Even when the present situation is not working or is horrible. And as we said, instead, we tend to do more and more of what does not work. And that, in many ways, is the real definition of stinking thinking or of addiction. And the reason we do anything more than one time, the reason we do it over and over again, is often because the time we did it before doesn't really satisfy us deeply in any sort of depth. Again, Richard uses all these different quotes, so we'll finish with a quote from W.H. Auden, the English poet. We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the present and let our illusions die. So we can have a little think about the ego, about Paul's idea of the paradox of Jesus' teaching, the idea of letting go of subtraction rather than addition being the way of change. And we can think about those metaphors, the poverty of spirit, the single grain of wheat that must fall into the earth, the branch that must be cut from the vine. We can have a think about some of those metaphors that Jesus has used. So there we have step one. We admit that we are powerless over our addictions, over our stinking thinking, and that our lives have become unmanageable. Step one of the 12 steps. Thanks for joining. Goodbye. God bless.